Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 build guide. Today I'm going to be covering my pick for the best Cleric build in Baldur's Gate 3. I'll of course be using Shadowheart as the example character here, and this is the actual build that I use for Shadowheart, but this is also a build that could be very useful for any main character Cleric if you wanted to do that instead. This is also a build that will be pretty happy soloing, I think. It's not going to be the highest damage output at the end of the game, but it's got some really strong tricks that let you do tons of damage, as well as being generally quite tanky. Clerics are one of the best classes in the game because they can do pretty much everything. They can nuke like a wizard, they can tank like a fighter, and they can mix it up in melee combat reasonably well as well. Shadowheart is a high half-elf, which is unfortunately one of the worst races for a cleric. The reason for this is that the weapon and armor proficiencies, or rather the armor and shield proficiencies, that the high half-elf gives you are wasted on clerics because you get those from cleric anyways, and the bonus cantrip that you get scales off your intelligence, which on a cleric we want to reduce as much as possible. The best races for cleric are pretty much our old friend the Wood Elf is going to be the best, but in particular I think that you want one that has some way of gaining perception proficiency, whether that be from your background or from your race. So Wood Elf definitely fits that bill with the extra movement speed and perception proficiency, but any other race that gives you that proficiency will be really valuable. Since cleric skill with wisdom and perception skills with wisdom, the fact that they can't take it on their normal skill list is a real downside for this class, and something that we want to make up for from our background and race. But let's level Shadowheart. So, Shadowheart has a starting stat spread that, like all of the other companion characters, is not very good and that we will need to fix. Although I will say this is closer to being a good stat spread than most of them. It's just got 3 odd numbers, but this is at least close to the proportions for stats that you're going to want. That being said, we can definitely improve it, so let's go with get our Constitution up to 16 and our Wisdom up to 16. Almost every casting class is going to want 16 in their main stat and 16 Constitution. And then we can build up strength and dexterity. Which of these you have at 12 and which at 14, I think, is going to depend a little on what you want your character to do. The 14 is good because if you're a medium armor class, then most medium armors cap your AC from dexterity at 2, but we are actually going to be getting heavy armor access, so the dexterity will not be giving us AC. On the other hand, initiative is quite powerful as well. My recommendation is that you build 14 strength and 12 dexterity. That way you still have some initiative bonus, and don't lose any AC. But in the early game, you might want more dexterity and less strength, and then maybe you respec and switch that number. And if you find yourself needing more initiative on this character, who definitely does struggle with that, then you are going to want to increase your dexterity as well. Finally, for a main character, Cleric is one of the classes that benefits the most from using the method to increase your stat by 1, which I won't spoil, but in the early game, there's a way that you can increase one of your attributes by 1 point, and Cleric benefits amongst the most for from that. So if you are a solo build, you're definitely going to want to grab that and then take a stat spread more like this so that you can get your wisdom to 20 using only 2 feet, or using only 1 feat instead of 2. For our cantrip selection, we definitely want to have access to the single best cantrip in the game and close to the best spell in the game, Guidance. Succeeding on skill checks way more often is so powerful with Guidance. I also highly recommend having Resistance because there's a lot of dialogue checks where Resistance will come up and give you some additional saves, and that can be really useful for passing saves during dialogues. It also is not terrible to cast just in combat, but you're going to have way better things to concentrate on, so this is mostly for dialogue checks, but is still quite useful. And then finally, you probably want Sacred Flame just so that you can do some damage with a cantrip, although for much of the game, you're going to be better off firing a ranged weapon, or using, even with negative intelligence, using Shadowheart's Firebolt cantrip than using Sacred Flame, just because it does no damage if the opponent succeeds against it, so often you're actually going to be better off using a crossbow attack in the early game. Finally, we have to look at Shadowheart's domain. And unfortunately, Trickery Domain is the weakest of the 7 Cleric domains available in the game, for a number of reasons. One is that the main thing that it gives you is Blessing of the Trickster, and then at a higher level, Invoke Duplicity, allowing you to summon an illusion that gives advantage to allies. But Invoke Duplicity costs an action. Blessing of the Trickster gives you advantage on stealth checks, which doesn't particularly matter. And the best that you get from Invoke Duplicity is advantage on attacks. Spending an action to give an ally advantage on attacks is not strong. Trickery Domain also has a lot of duplicate spells that are already on the Cleric's spell list, and what you want from your domain spells, which are always prepared, is spells that are not on the Cleric's spell list, because that's going to increase your overall total access to spells. So we're looking for a domain that gives us better spell access, as well as a couple other things. The other thing that Trickery Domain doesn't get is there are 3 domains here that give you medium armor proficiency, and the other 4 give you heavy armor proficiency. Heavy armor, especially for a cleric who doesn't really want to build dexterity, is way better than medium armor in the late game, and so it's really important to get access to heavy armor. Finally, Tempest and War Domain get access to martial weapon proficiencies, which does come up a little bit, but isn't as important. But Life, Nature, Tempest, and War all get access to heavy armor, and so are really good. Of those, Nature I think is the weakest, because while it does give you a bunch of spells that aren't on the druid or aren't on the cleric spell list, they are mostly not very good spells overall. So unless you really want to speak with animals, I would avoid Nature Domain. Life Domain is very good as a 1-level dip because it gives you this feature that gives you additional HP on your healing. But for a main character, a main cleric, it's less powerful because you won't want your cleric to spend most of their turns healing. You would much rather them be buffing your allies, destroying your enemies, tanking, making attacks. Healing is a pretty inefficient use of your actions, and so the spell that you are going to end up using for healing most often is Healing Word, which is a bonus action. It benefits quite heavily from Disciple of Life, but because it +3 healing on Healing Word will increase the amount of healing that it outputs by like 50%, but that becomes less powerful as you level up, and you won't really want to use higher level healing spells. That said, Life Domain is still a very good cleric domain, but in my opinion, the best cleric domain, and the one that you should take on Shadowheart or a main character cleric, is Tempest. Tempest gets martial weapon access, it gets access to a number of very good spells that are not on the cleric spell list, and even better, it gets access to a unique spell that Tempest Cleric is the only character in the game that can cast it, and that's both really cool and also extremely powerful. Fog Cloud is also one of the best control spells in the early game, so this is a really nice one to have access to, and the Wrath of the Storm reaction, since you're going to be mixing it up in melee, gives you some additional damage. Clerics won't have a lot of use for their reactions in the early game, so this can be very helpful. Finally, another one worth mentioning, even though it only gets medium armor access, is Light Domain, because it has the best or second best defensive ability in the game, Warding Flare. You can give an enemy disadvantage on attacking you, and that's incredibly powerful, and then at level 6 you can use that to protect an ally, so that's even better. And you can do this any number of times, it's not limited in any way, so as long as you have a reaction, you can give an enemy disadvantage. This is a super powerful defensive ability, but I think overall you're going to want heavy armor and the really good spell access from Tempest Domain more than Light Domain. But I think in sort of order of power level, I would say Tempest, Light, and then Life in that order, and then the others are all lagging further behind those 3, which are the best. Our spell selection we don't have to make right now, of course, it's just based on what we want to prepare. So let's hit confirm and level up, and let me take a look real quick at just what spells we have access to in our spellbook. So, because it's important to decide what spells you want. So we're always going to have Thunderwave, we'll always have Fog Cloud. You will always want Healing Word prepared and Bless, which is one of the best things that you can be doing with your actions. The other two, I think, are less set in stone. I really like having Guiding Bolt just because it's a nice damage option, especially at low levels. At later levels, you're going to want to upgrade Create or Destroy Water. And Command is really good because it can cost an opponent their entire turn, so that's a very nice way to spend your turn stopping the opponent from doing anything. Gives you quite a lot of additional utility on this character. I'll go over sort of what spells you want to have prepared at each level as we level up. So you have access to heavy armor and shields. You're going to have pretty good AC. You also, at level 2, get this Destructive Wrath ability. That gives you the option to maximize the damage of any thunder or lightning spell that you cast. Lightning spells benefit from this even better because an enemy with the wet condition, such as from Create Water, which you, as a cleric, have access to, take double damage from lightning spells. So maximized and doubled damage from lightning spells means that you can often just one-shot enemies with any form of lightning spell, and because we're a Tempest cleric, we get access to most of the lightning spells in the game. For our prepared spells, we can now add in one more here, so I think this is a pretty good starting set. I like to add in either Create Water, or Sanctuary is also quite good. You have to be a little creative with how you use it, because it does stop your ally from acting, but as a bonus action that can really prevent an enemy from... that can save someone in a bad situation, Sanctuary is quite powerful. Now we get access to level 2 spells, including Shatter and Gust of Wind, both very useful to have access to for the Cleric. I highly recommend also that you prepare Spiritual Weapon. Most of your turns in the early game are going to, or most of your fights in the early game are going to look like you casting Bless on your 3 damage-dealing allies and Spiritual Weapon, because this is a bonus action that summons a unit on turn 1. Then, on subsequent turns, you're either going to be casting Guiding Bolt or just attacking with a melee weapon. Most of these other level 2 options you don't need at this point, although Hold Person can be very powerful, so maybe you want to remove Create or Destroy Water for that. But enemies will spend their turns focusing the Spiritual Weapon, and it only costs you a bonus action to cast. Clerics mostly don't have good uses for their bonus actions, so it's really nice to have an option that is so powerful and has such high utility in the early game. As we level up here, you get access to another cantrip. I like having Blade Ward and Light. Both are quite useful, but Blade Ward, I think, has a lot of fun creative options you can do with it. For example, if there are 2 neutral factions fighting one another, casting Blade Ward on one of them gives them resistance on all damage, which is very powerful, and doesn't involve you in the fight. So if you want to turn 2 sets of enemies against each other and have one side win without getting involved in the fight, Blade Ward can be very useful. For our feat, we are of course going to be upgrading our Wisdom. Very important to do that. With almost any caster, you want to make sure you are hitting your maximum casting ability, because that determines the DC of your spells, and thus how often opponents fail their saves against them. At level 5, you get access to Chain Lightning from being a Tempest Cleric, which is really powerful, as well as Spirit Guardians, which is another thing that you might want to spend your turns concentrating on. Because you have heavy armor and a shield and very strong defensive abilities, you can just get into melee with your Spirit Guardians running, and opponents will take 3d8 of damage every turn. That's super powerful. You can also just do a guaranteed 30 or 60 to a wet enemy damage every turn with Call Lightning using your maximized lightning damage. And just one-shotting enemies with 60 damage at the start of a fight is really powerful. So these are going to be incredibly useful abilities to have access to. I also quite like Mass Healing Word, because sometimes it's nice to just provide healing to all of your allies, so that's very good as well. We're taking pretty much only Cleric all the way through, with because we need to hit at least level 11 Cleric to get access to level 6 spells, and the Cleric level 6 spells are quite good, so we actually do want to access those. But whether we take another feat or a dip into another class is the main decision that we're going to have to make, and I'll answer that when we hit level 12. This one is kind of nice. You can push enemies with Thunderbolt Strike. Pushing enemies is good if they are in melee with you, and you have the ability to add extra thunder damage to your attacks because you're a Tempest Cleric, so you can use that and then push the enemy back and then run away without taking an opportunity attack. We absolutely want to have Spirit Guardians prepared. I also quite like Healing Word, and I quite like Animate Dead as well. Animate Dead gives you a lot of options just because having a summon running around can be very useful. There's all sorts of stuff you can do with that, whether that be setting up sneak attacks for your rogue, whether that be just distracting enemies, whether that just be some additional damage. Having extra units on the field is very powerful, so consider spending a spell slot on Animate Dead. Level 4 is where we get some of the best options for Clerics. We get Ice Storm as a Tempest Cleric, which is still pretty good, but mostly what we want here from level 4 is Banishment. Banishment takes an enemy out of the fight completely if they fail their save, and it's a Charisma saving throw, which many enemies will have low Charisma, so it can be very useful to target those enemies with Banishment, and you're very likely to knock them out of the fight for 2 turns. Taking a powerful enemy out of the fight for 2 turns will give you time to clean up all the other enemies. Very powerful to have access to Banishment as well. At level 8, we're of course going to take our ability improvement, but if you already have 20 wisdom because you started with 17 and gained 1, then instead of that, the feat that you're going to want is Alert. This solves all of your initiative problems, and being unable to be surprised is really good. I think Alert is mandatory for almost any solo build, so if you're planning to solo on this character, you really want to get Alert. You might even want to stay at 18 Wisdom and pick up Alert on level 4 instead of picking it up on level 8, because it's just that powerful. In Baldur's Gate 3, Initiative is rolled on a d4, so +5 initiative means that you have a bonus that is twice the average initiative roll that most characters will get at all. So you're basically guaranteed to win initiative against any enemy that doesn't also have Alert, if you have Alert. Finally, at level 5, we get access to Destructive Wave, a spell that appears nowhere except on the Tempest Cleric spell list. And it's a very good spell because it hits a ton of... It has a giant AoE, 30-foot AoE centered on your character, which is very powerful. And one thing that it doesn't tell you here is it doesn't hit allies. So you can use this in the middle of a big scrum, and it takes out enemies. It hits enemies, but doesn't hit allies. Knocking enemies prone is super powerful as well because it gives your other guys advantage on attacks. So this is, I think, a really powerful spell that only this character can access. At level 10, we get Divine Intervention, which allows you to do some pretty cool effects. The best of these is summoning a weapon. You summon a unique mace, and it's a +3 mace with a bunch of other fun effects. So you'll definitely want to use that, and that will often be the best weapon for a cleric to carry alongside their shield. Shadowheart, of course, makes very good use of this, although she does have access to a couple other unique weapons that might be more powerful, but the Divine Intervention weapon is incredibly strong, so you're almost always going to want to spend your Divine Intervention on that. You get an extra cantrip, take kind of whatever. But you also have your level 5 spells available as well, so let's make sure that we've got some good ones. I'll talk about our sort of default spell list when we also hit our max level as well. go with Flame Strike here. And finally, we hit level 11 Cleric and get access to 6 level spells. This gives us Create Undead or Planar Ally, both of which are very powerful summons, and which you want, I think, is going to vary depending on what the day is. Hero's Feast is also very good if you're adventuring with a full party. Having advantage on wisdom saves is pretty nice. With the Cleric's wisdom save proficiency, it means you pretty much won't ever fail a wisdom save. And immunity to poison, disease, and frightened can be very good as well. If you watched my build with the Fart Druid, then you can use Hero's Feast to allow your whole party to stand in the toxic clouds, much like that character gets to. And I really like that build, so if you haven't checked that one out, definitely do. And then, of course, also Blade Barrier is just really good damage, so very powerful effect to have access to. Finally, at level 12, we already have access to level 6 spells, so the question is, do we want a feat more, or do we want the class features of another class at level 1 more? And I think that the answer is that there is a couple class features that are good enough. We definitely want access to those, so I will put a 1 level dip into another class rather than finish off Cleric, although of course you could just max out Cleric, no problem. And if you do want to max out Cleric, then you should probably use a respec to go to 15 Constitution, and the feat that you should take will be Resilient in Constitution, gaining 1, putting you back up to 16, gaining a couple points in some other stats, and gaining proficiency in Constitution saving throws. If you don't want to use a respec, then Warcaster is also good, but Resilient Constitution is going to be a slightly better bonus to your concentration saves, and it's very important not to fail concentration saves on this character. That being said, I think that the optimal way to build this is actually to take a 1 level dip into Sorcerer. And the reason for this is that you are able to take the Storm Sorcery subclass, which gives you Tempestuous Magic, allowing you to move every time you cast a spell as a bonus action. Like I said, Clerics don't have a lot of uses for their bonus actions, so having the opportunity attack free movement lets you evade enemies very strongly. I should also say that actually the most powerful thing to do here is to take 1 level of Wizard, which gives you 6th level Wizard spells, thanks to the way Wizards learn spells from scrolls. And I will be doing a build that features that, but since I think that that's based arguably on a glitch and is a little cheesy, the best sort of non-cheaty build is with Sorcerer, where you gain access to Storm Sorcery. You also, with Sorcerer, get access to another really excellent defensive tool, and that is, of course, the Shield spell. Shield giving you a reaction that lets you raise your AC by 5. Since we're going to have quite high AC at this point in the game, probably around 22 to 24 AC, the Shield spell can let us boost our AC up to 27 to 29, which makes us incredibly difficult to hit. And then, of course, you also get access to at least 1 other spell. Some that are kind of fun to do are Expeditious Retreat is quite good. It gives you extra mobility, which is very powerful. I also don't hate having Witch Bolt. It will use your Charisma, so you're unlikely to hit with it. But since you're a Tempest Cleric, having Witch Bolt is a good damage option if you can find something that you're guaranteed to hit with it, of which there's a couple things that you might want to use it for. Also, it never hurts to have access to Featherfall or Magic Missile or whatever, so... But mostly we just want Shield from this. And Storm Sorcery, which is both on theme for our Tempest Cleric and also gives us the extremely powerful Tempestuous Magic ability. What cantrips we choose from this are mostly not relevant, since we won't be using them for attacks, and by this point in the game, we should have our utility set up already, but Minor Illusion and Mage Hand are both still very good, so you might want to take those anyways, and then just having something like Light or Dancing Light, having access to those, since we haven't taken them in our Cleric portion of the build, will be really strong. What we're going to want to end up with as our sort of final prepared spell list is... Let me get this going here. For our final spell list, I think we are very likely to want access to just going to clear all of this and take only the mandatory ones here. You will always want Healing Word. You will always want Bless. Those are going to stay relevant all the way up until the late game. I also think that Create or Destroy Water is really good up until the late game. Spiritual Weapon is a really nice bonus action that is quite powerful. Again, all the way up to the late game, you're going to want that. Spirit Guardians will still have a ton of utility over the course of the game. It's very good damage. You'll mostly be using Call Lightning instead of it as your level 3 concentration spell, but it's still nice to have access to it. Mass Healing Word I wouldn't leave home without. Banishment is the best offensive option for Clerics, and then over here, Flame Strike it's nice to have access to for a high ranged damage option, and then you can alternate with Destructive Wave. The others of the level 5 spells are less powerful, but some of the level 6 spells, it will depend on which of Create Undead or Planar Ally you want. You won't be able to cast both since you only get one level 6 spell slot. But I would either use that or save your level 6 spell slot for Blade Barrier, so I like Planar Ally. The rest of the spells here are kind of what utility you want. Having Guiding Bolt, which you can upcast to do pretty good damage, is kind of nice. Silence is always valuable, so I would probably take that as well. Remove Curse comes up way more often than you would think it does, and Animate Dead is still very good. And then finally, I would probably just take something like Guardian of Faith, which is just decent damage. And it's never terrible to have heal, although Hold Person is also quite valuable. At this point in the game, you'll be able to have a pretty good idea of what spells you need for your party, but the most important ones are things like Healing Word and Bless. In fact, all the way up until the late game, your Cleric is going to spend most of their early turns just casting Bless, and Spiritual Weapon. That's going to be like the first 7 levels of your character, because that will be the most optimal turn that you can take. And for that reason, I want to highlight one item in particular that's incredibly good for this character, and that is the Staff of Arcane Blessing, which you get in Mistress Temple below the Goblin Camp, I believe, and it doubles the bonus from Bless. This is an insane amount of extra to hit roll, and is going to make your party way, way more effective if you have this equipped and are using Bless frequently. Alright, my friends, this has been my pick for the best Cleric in Baldur's Gate 3. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and as always, if you have, do please take the time to leave a comment, like the video, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. GG.